Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight. We have a great lineup of speakers to talk us through the past, the present and the future implications of automation and its impact on workplace practices and workers' rights. My name is Carolyn Jones. I'm the Director of the Institute of Employment Rights, and I'm going to be chairing this event tonight. As we know, COVID has brought technology into our homes at an unprecedented rate. For some, that's helped retain jobs and income. For trade unionists, it has often helped reach out to vast numbers of members and the public on Zoom calls. But like most technology, AI has the potential to bring perils as well as possibilities. In 2019, the ILO launched a report called The Future of Work, which considered the changing nature of work and the need for lifelong learning, for greater inclusivity and gender equality, for human well-being, and a role for universal social protection to deliver a stable and just future of work. When launching that report, Cyril Ramaphosa, who was the chair of the commission, said, "In the 20th century, we established that labour is not a commodity. In the 21st century, we must ensure it's not a robot." And earlier this year, the TUC also undertook research into the impact of artificial intelligence, publishing 3 reports, one of which was a manifesto on the values we should adopt to ensure technology works for the benefits of us all. We've got no time tonight to go through those reports, but information on both the ILO and the TUC information will be put into chat box. We know that all too often technology is used not to improve the lives of workers, but to control the labour process. Such control, added to the weak and complicated employment protections offered to UK workers, too often lead to alienation and exploitation. But in many ways, the adoption of artificial intelligence systems parallels the adoption of other technologies like machinery and robotics. So our time tonight will be spent assessing what we can learn from how technology was introduced into workplaces in the past and how we can take those lessons forward in this, the 4th industrial age. How do we assert some level of worker control over the introduction, the use and development of AI at work? They're just some of the questions that we will look at tonight. And talking of time, it has come to our attention that there's a football game on tonight. So with the assistance of our speakers and the excellent work of my colleagues, James Harrison and Sarah Glenister, who will be pulling the levers of this event behind the scenes, we intend to finish no later than 8 o'clock this evening. So let's crack on and introduce our first speaker. And our first speaker tonight is Louisa Bull. Louisa is the National Officer in Unite, responsible for print, media and IT workers. She's been a full-time official since 1997, formerly with the GPMU. Prior to that, she worked in the newsroom at the Daily Telegraph, but we won't hold that against you tonight, Louisa. Louisa's been a long-time friend of the Institute, assisting us on many occasions and sharing her knowledge and understanding of the sector with our officers. So, Louisa, speak to us about the historical and legal landscape of automation. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Cad. And thank you for inviting me to speak at this meeting. I intend actually to draw your attention upon the important work undertaken by the TUC in the recently published Dignity at Work and the AI Revolution. So I'm going to talk some of what you just referred to in terms of what we might not have time for, Cad, having been party to that working party. But the manifesto drew upon both a law report entitled Technology Managing People by Robin Allen and Dean Master, and a workers' experience document released last November by the TUC, much of which was based on a survey of unions and their reps. and hopefully you'll get some links in the chat to these documents. So in 2013, Frey and Osborne, in their Future of Employment, How Susceptible Are Jobs to Computerisation, found that computerisation could wipe out 47% of jobs. This was challenged by others, arguing computerisation would not wipe out the whole job, but only part. But in the 8 years since, much has changed. Indeed, because of the pandemic, it can be argued that certain processes have accelerated the impact on the workplace and on the supply chain. Along with the climate change and the greening of the economy, AI and automation will be the biggest challenge facing organised labour for the next decade and beyond. By January 2016, the World Economic Forum founder, Klaus Schwab, declared the fourth industrial revolution is before us, and he warned that humans must control this or the consequences would be severe. Well, colleagues, the consequences are already severe. You can go into workplaces now where the technology is controlling the human, and the impact on the human is for all of us to see. As workers complain of increasing mental health issues arising from the loss of control, a loss of normal human interaction, and a loss of their identity. Because of the breadth of the impact of AI and automation on every country's economy, it is not possible for collective bargaining alone to address the challenge to workers and their rights. Legislation is called for, and yet there has been no new legislation in the UK. The EU is discussing it, and some European countries have already passed new laws, such as the right to disconnect in Spain and France. But in the UK, we've got nothing. The lack of legislation does not only expose UK workers to increased health risk, discrimination through use of biased data and being subjected to automated decisions in interview processes, disciplinary and pay rise reviews, it threatens the very existence of mass employment. The almost immediate transition to home working of millions of workers is coupled with an explosion of surveillance and monitoring applications capable of recording workers' actions and their decisions in unprecedented detail. This big data is then easily transferable to establish patterns which can result in algorithms leading to converting such work into automated systems. The loss of human interaction often accompanies home working, so our jobs can be distilled more easily. But not all jobs, not all responsibilities, but sufficient to result in possible mass job loss. There's a double whammy here, of course, because remote working can be a serious threat to innovation that actually creates our jobs. The TUC report argues that the 1990s disabilities campaign slogan, "Nothing about us without us," could be resurrected, whereas at present the truth is almost everything about us is happening without us. And if it was not for those IT engineers across the globe whose principles, values and ethical positions continually expose how this tech can be utilised, we would know even less. And as our politicians and lawmakers prevaricate, the technology marches on. We have yet to experience the rollout of 5G, yet in certain IT labs across the globe, discussions and preliminary work is happening in the development of 6G. Current legislation is inadequate, but even that is not being used properly. The report from the TUC that I mentioned earlier sets out better than I can how the UK legislation needs to change to ensure technology at work is for the benefit of all. It details very clearly the need for far-reaching legislation, and yet some key changes are less technical For example, an amendment to the UK data protection legislation is required in order for trade unions, employees and workers to understand whether data is being processed ethically, lawfully and without discrimination. There should be an obligation to provide meaningful information about the logic involved. As well as that, the UK's data protection regime should be amended to state that discriminatory data processing is always unlawful. Thirdly, the Employment Rights Act 1996 should be amended to create a right which can be enforced in the Employment Tribunal for workers not to be subjected to detrimental treatment, including dismissal due to the processing of inaccurate data. And one that is often talked about is the right to disconnect. Sorry, I've just lost my place in my place, believe me, I'm not sorry. So I'm really sorry about this, and I've lost where I was in my notes. But the right to disconnect, which is the most important one that we've got. At the moment, if we stay working the way we are, people will have no work-life balance at all. And this influence over us is going to be really a particular bad point in time. But whilst we argue about legislation, there are lots of things that trade unions can be doing. We can be arguing to get collective agreements in place to set out certain principles. Everyone at work should have a say in deciding whether AI is introduced to make important decisions about people. There should be genuine and active consultation with unions and workers before new technologies are introduced. Workers should be educated about the value of personal data, how this is used by their employer, and how data is used to inform AI systems. They should also have control and influence over how their data is used at work. So there are a lot of ways in which the trade union can be taking a real lead part in how we discuss our activities and we negotiate at work. None of these are difficult for us. None of these are without achievement on a day-to-day basis. When we're implementing new technologies, employers should do this with respect. Their importance of negotiating with our members all the time. This is why we also need a public interest data law, providing workers and employees with rights regarding the introduction of AI into the workplace. There must be full transparency and accountability if we are to avoid the work access that the technology is capable of providing to exploitative employers. It is crucial to maintain some degree of human involvement in decision-making at work. Without this, unfair decisions made by technology are more likely to go unchallenged and unquestioned. As employers collect and use worker data, workers should have a reciprocal right to collect and use their own data. None of these principles will be worth anything if unions can't organise labour. Remote working means much of what we have used over the last century to recruit workers will no longer work. Across the world, unions are using social media to organise workplaces and to communicate with current members and even to run strikes. So the use of artificial intelligence and automated decision-making is developing every day. Machine learning and algorithms touch every fabric of society, and within our workplaces and our homes, we need to ensure we understand them, have the ability to control them, and are safeguarded from them as best as we can. Whilst we must embrace technology, machines must work for us, and humans must be in control of all decisions. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Louisa. Great to hear from you. I should say that Louisa was struggling with a loss of voice today. it's all those rallies and gathering the troops together that you're doing. So thank you for agreeing to fulfill this event tonight. That was marvellous. You're quite right, collective bargaining has a big role to play in trying to control and determine how AI is introduced into the workplace. But of course, as you say, it needs the assistance of legislation to back up collective bargaining at the workplace. So thanks very much for your suggestions too on how the law could be changed to improve the lot. Your discussion about data protection, I think, will be taken up later in the event today by another of our speakers. So that's great. Thanks very much for that, Louisa. And to the audience, if you have questions or comments that you want to raise to Louisa or any of the others, put it in the Q&A at the end, now, and we can try and answer them as we go along too. That's just in case we don't have very much time at the end to take all the questions and comments. So I'm going to move swiftly on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Leonardo Impet. Leo recently moved back to the UK from Italy, and he is now an assistant professor at Durham University in the Artificial Intelligence and Human Systems Group, which I believe is part of the computer science department. Leo studies the overlap between visual computing and visual studies. I'm not sure what that means, but I'm sure Leo can tell us. I have shared platforms with Leo in the past, particularly when he spoke about the role of AI in the future of work. And I'm very pleased that you can join us here tonight. So Leo, good to have you with us. Your theme tonight is AI bias and workers' rights. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Carolyn, and thanks to the IER for putting the this great event together. It was fascinating to hear what Louisa just said, and I hope that I don't repeat too many of her points and sort of bore you with repetition. But if I am repeating things that she said, it's because I agree with them. So yeah, just a little bit of background on where I'm speaking from. As Carolyn said, I work in AI research or machine learning research, and some of my research is on AI and fairness or AI and bias, that sort of thing. So I'll talk a little bit about machine bias, and I also want to sort of contextualize this question of bias in artificial intelligence in terms of the automation debate more generally, more widely. I also wanted to, if I had time, to mention the opportunity of digital literacy and sort of computer programming for workers. I think mass worker literacy in computer programming is really a chance for a bright future, but it's something that, unfortunately, as I cut down my talk for today, I eliminated. But if there are questions about that, I'd be really excited to speak about it. Anyway, we're talking about perils and possibilities. I wouldn't have become a computer scientist if I didn't believe in the possibilities of computer science, of artificial intelligence, of automation. There are some great things going on at the TUC Digital Lab, social media and so on. But today we're going to talk about perils. Computer scientists, by the way, have been some of the best Luddites in recent history. This is an argument Gavin Muller makes in his latest book on Luddism. So in the 90s, big tech companies were trying to make company-specific programming languages so that if you trained at Microsoft, you'd be locked into their systems and you wouldn't be able to go and work for Apple or whatever. And the open source software movement, which was basically coordinated action by software workers, completely rejected that approach. And software workers have pretty much won that battle for the foreseeable future. All right, so anyway, long term in the right hands, of course, automation can be a wonderful thing, but I'm going to talk about the frankly more pessimistic and sort of urgent questions of automation in the next couple of years. And what I call, I hope I'm not being too rude here, but the sort of TED Talk management classes, the people buying those brightly colored business paperbacks at airports. They love to talk about win-win situations. And the one message I want to take away from today is that to be very wary of win-win situations when it comes to AI, a bit like electric cars. They're the green choice and they're faster than the petrol ones. So automation, new technology is going to automate away all of the terrible jobs and replace them with beautiful new high-skilled tech jobs. Well, of course, we know that the situation is a lot more complicated than that. So the crucial point I want to make here is that I think the next 12 to 24 months, the next year or so, are an absolutely crucial moment for automation in the workplace. So I'm not saying that automation hasn't come yet or that it's going to stop after that, but I do think that we're going to see a massive push towards especially AI-powered automation in the very near future in a way that we haven't really seen before. And what I think that means is that whatever new standards and practices get normalized in the next 2 years or so, the start of the 2020s, that sort of new social contract for automation is going to be the basis for what comes after, I think, for many decades in the future. So it's an excellent thing that, you know, relatively speaking, the trade union movement is on the front foot at the moment with union membership in rapid growth. So why are these 2 years so key? Well, I think there's three big factors here. The first, in the immediate term, and Louisa mentioned this as well, the sort of massively increased costs and especially risks of human workers during the pandemic have pushed people towards automation. So if you're running a warehouse at 100% sort of throughput, but you've only got 70% of the workers because of social distancing, you have to invest in automating away that 30% capacity, even if that's more expensive than traditional human labor would cost. So the consultancy McKinsey, in September 2020, they're a sort of classic management consultancy, you know, sort of go in, fire people, come out. They surveyed 800 top executives, and 67% of those, remember this is at the peak of the pandemic, September 2020, 67% had been investing into greater automation and 85% into increased digitization. So, you know, even in the long term, I think the risks of future pandemics and so on, they're going to weigh more heavily on business planners. They're going to be more explicitly modeled. And secondly, this is maybe more local, but also I think more permanent, is the relative scarcity of labour in the UK, which is of course also to do with Brexit as well as COVID, various factors. But there are labour shortages in things like transport and lower paid hospitality roles, industries which have traditionally relied on the super exploitation of labour, including migrant labour. And businesses are having to consider increasing wages and benefits to attract staff. Obviously, businesses don't want to do that, so instead they turn to automation. And here we're talking mainly about things like self-checkout machines, you know, force multipliers for relatively low-paid labour. The third factor, again, just in the next couple of years, is genuine technological innovations. So my claim somehow is that most recent waves of what is self-branded as disruptive technological innovations, you know, self-checkout machines, ride-hailing apps, whatever, they're actually pretty dumb technologically, right? It doesn't take a genius to say, well, we could replace phoning up a taxi service with making a little app on your phone that shows you the service on a map or whatever. So none of them use anything like what we call AI or machine learning in the sort of computer science world. But that's not to say that AI doesn't exist. It is there in the research world, especially in the past couple of years, especially since 2015 and even more since 2018. And it is coming into the business world. So I'd say a sort of landmark thing to look out for here is the GPT-3 neural network made by OpenAI in 2020. And that can pretty much generate text that's indistinguishable from human text. And it can also automate away a lot of low-level human tasks. You give it some examples and it follows those examples, and including, by the way, simple computer programming. So it can do things like web programming by following examples and sort of automate away some of the lower paid programming that traditionally is outsourced. So I think we can expect a real wave of specifically AI-driven automation in the next 1 or 2 years. Obviously, I'm not the first person to say this or the only person. And that one article I'd maybe point you to, which is interesting, not perfect, obviously, not hyper radical, but interesting. An article made by Joseph Stiglitz and Anton Korinek, the famous economists, in the British Medical Journal, actually at the invitation of the WHO, specifically on COVID-driven automation as a factor. And they, to economists, they say that that's going to have a massive negative effect on wages and increase inequalities, especially between owners and workers at a global level. And I've been talking here a little bit about sort of low-paid jobs in my examples, but in fact, it's automating away the higher-paid jobs that's worth more money per replacement to the management, of course. So just before COVID in 2019, the economist Richard Baldwin was writing about what he called white-collar robots, right? So rather than sort of computer-controlled welders, you have journalists or whatever. In fact, if we look at the news industry, you know, in the news and print industry, as Louisa has a background there, you know, in the 80s, it was the printers. Today, it's the journalists, and many other related trades, things like insurance brokers, radiologists is a big one, legal services staff. So high-paid office professions. All right, so next 2 years, I think specifically we have to organize for a big push on what kind of automation, therefore, we welcome and what kind we reject, because it's going to be very difficult to go in reverse gear after that point. I think the advantage here is on our side. Both kinds of automation are profitable. You know, automation always leads to less money spent. So businesses want both, but we have to make the bad kind as difficult as possible for businesses to steer them in the right direction. And that means fighting tooth and nail to raise, of course, the quality of jobs, which is something Louisa was also talking about. And here I'm quite optimistic. I've seen what the IER, the TUC, Unite and other unions have been doing in the last couple of years. And they've been very clear in setting out things like the AI manifesto. But I'd say that we have to be even more explicit in terms of what the basic requirements are in accepting automation in the workplace. They have to be so hard and fast that when a business calls in, you know, McKinsey or Boston Consulting or whatever, and tell them that they have to slim down costs in the light of COVID, they don't even think of going near the bad kind of automation because that fight will cost them far more than it's worth. So I think the clearer these goalposts are well in advance, as I say, I'm impressed by things like the AI Revolution Manifesto. I think there's great stuff in there, but the clearer the goalposts are, the better we stand a chance of maintaining high standards in the longer term. One slight technicality, I'm just looking at the time. I think I'm all right. I'm on 9.5 minutes. One slight technicality, if I go on a bit of a sidetrack. I don't think this is going to be solved by paperwork. So one of the things that the TUC is calling for is for data discrimination to be considered as part of the data protection impact assessment under GDPR. And, you know, theoretically, that's extremely important. But from a technical perspective, be clear, most of the management using these AI systems haven't got the foggiest clue of how they actually work. And in terms of the developers, the computer scientists, you know, my students or whatever, this stuff is so easy to fake because there are a million different technical definitions of bias, of fairness, and so on. And you could just pick the easiest one to conform to. You can just, you know, take one out of some research paper and slap that on the paperwork and get around it. So I think we have to be a bit wary of sort of self-regulation or paperwork as a way of dealing with bias questions. All right, so I said the goalposts should be as clear as possible. I think it's pretty clear what some of the goalposts should be. There's a big question in terms of de-skilling. You know, I think probably we'll hear about de-skilling in the Uber case. I think we have to understand that de-skilling is often about changing a service slightly rather than just automating away let's say, more costly or higher skilled part of the job, right? So this is something like the vending machine model. It's actually worse than a cafe, but you can do it a lot more cheaply. And there are, of course, situations where automation can help upskilling, or it can at least help, you know, release pressure on some of the least skilled and least enjoyable sections of the job. So automated marking, for instance, in schools and universities is one of those situations where you can automate away in either direction. And it has to be very clear that only one of those directions is not going to encounter resistance. We've heard about lack of worker control and independence, the sort of computer says no problem. That's especially to do with digitization of workflows. You know, the individual workers can no longer make exceptions to the rules. But I think we have to be careful not to phrase that just as a sort of how satisfied are you with your job psychological thing. That's a pretext often for lower wages, right? Less control. We've seen that in the transportation industry, for instance, with safety, is a pretext for reducing wages. And then I'll move on to you know, the other things which are more, which I can talk about in a tiny bit more detail. Don't worry, I won't go over my 15 minutes, but surveillance is something that Louisa had also mentioned. And we've seen AI in human resources for a while now, which is a kind of machine surveillance, let's say. Employees at Canon IT have smile recognition systems now at work in their offices in Beijing. And if that seems sort of laughable, much more sinister things have been going on at Amazon. So in 2019, it was revealed that the Amazon worker tracking system in the US generates the paperwork to fire warehouse workers if they're not meeting targets automatically. It writes them up a letter automatically, and that included over 300 workers in a single year in a single warehouse in Baltimore. And there were reports of awful things that workers are doing to have to meet those targets, like urinating in bottles in their trucks to meet delivery targets and things like that. And obviously, since the pandemic, we've seen companies taking that surveillance even faster. So things like monitoring keystrokes, taking webcam footage of our own living rooms, things like that. But linked to the surveillance question is, and this is where it gets into my research a bit, is the question of bias and sort of automated decision making. So in 2018, Amazon again was forced to scrap an AI recruitment tool that preferred men over women. And there are several sort of well-documented cases of racial bias in algorithms. But I think the really important thing to understand here in terms of racial bias and automated decision-making, and I see this misunderstood often, is that it's not necessarily the programmer's bias that is being accidentally copied into the algorithm. And it's not necessarily a biased in a scientific sense, as in a non-representative data set that is being put into the algorithm. Simply, if there are latent correlations that are out there that a machine can exploit, it will. So for instance, we have work in our department on automated CCTV systems. Completely automated, it looks at the CCTV and it flags up when something funky is going on so that somebody can manually check it. Now, there's a clear correlation between how much money you earn and how likely it is that you're going to get caught for shoplifting, right? I haven't seen the statistics, but I don't think that's a particularly controversial thing to hypothesize. Right, so a machine trained on data, on real world data of real world shoplifters is going to start looking for people that look a bit poor. That's simply a latent correlation in the data that it can use to increase its accuracy slightly. Same thing for women earning less. If it's true on average, it's actually something that the machine is going to start operating on. There's no question of causality versus correlation in deep learning. So anything that's there is going to be used. And that's I think, where we have to understand that it's not enough to say, well, let's make a data set which is, perfectly representative and let's have a diverse group of programmers making it and so on. That's not going to allow us to get over that problem. I've noticed I'm coming up to the end of my time, so I just want to point out one thing, which is there's a lot of anti-union activities as well being used that are related to this surveillance thing. So again, going back to Amazon and their subsidiary Whole Foods, they've got actually sophisticated network analysis to trace stores at risk of unionization over its 100,000 almost workers in the US, and something similar is going on at Walmart. So we have to be prepared for a kind of new wave of digital blacklisting. And frankly, we should be on the front foot. And one thing I wanted to propose, and I'll finish on this, is, well, what if we turn the tables? We've talked about the digital lab and unions organizing over the internet and things like that. Why can there not be a kind of reverse digital blacklist where we have our own digital repositories listing which employers are the least friendly to workers and to their trade unions, where they're actively dissuading unions or where they're not engaging with them, where they routinely break employment practices and so on. And we can put that into job market websites and things. Good. I've got over my time, so I'll stop. And I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much for that, Leo. That was incredibly interesting. You touched on so many issues. I'm sure there will be questions and comments put into the Q&A for you to consider. If I get the opportunity to come back to you, I will say that a number of the items you discussed, maybe surveillance, is going to be part of a future event the Institute is looking at in terms of human rights and employment rights. So that will be covered at that event. We've got an event coming up on unemployment and workers' rights, which will again touch on some of these issues and touch on the need to address shorter working time, because redistribution of working time and wealth is something that might be able to deal with the growth in AI and technological development and help hold back the forces of unemployment. So that is great. Thank you so much for that. You mentioned there in your contribution some of the companies that have some of the worst practices, Amazon and Walmart being two of them. But our final speaker tonight is going to not only look at the practices of another company, but also how workers have organised and argued to fight back. So our final speaker tonight is James Farrer. James is the General Secretary of the ACDTU, which is the Union for App Drivers and Couriers. After a career in the technology sector, James joined Uber as a driver, so bottom up in 2014, and experienced firsthand how Uber categorizes itself as simply the driver's booking agent rather than the employer, which that allows Uber to then escape public liability, to escape workers' rights, and to escape VAT obligations. James and a colleague, Yassine Aslam, went on to become the lead test claimants in the Aslam versus Uber case, for which the UK Supreme Court just recently ruled in favour of the workers. During that case, Uber used extensive data collection about how the two had used, how they collected information about James and his colleague that they gathered using surveillance. And as a result of that experience, James went on to found the Worker Info Exchange as a digital rights charity to support gig workers in accessing their personal data and to demand algorithmic transparency at work. So a lot of the topics we've been already discussing tonight. Tonight, James will bring us up to date with the legal and technical elements of his case. So, James, the AI used by Uber is not particularly smart tech, which was something that Leo just touched on, but the way they use it ratchets up exploitation and alienation. So tell us your experience of life in the gig economy, how you fought it, and what, in your opinion, lies ahead. So screen is yours, James.
Thanks very much. If it's possible to share, if you could, I will talk anyway, but I have a few slides to share if it's possible to share them. Yes, I'm pleased to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. I have a dual role as General Secretary of the App Drivers and Couriers Union and also as Director of Worker Info Exchange, which is a digital rights organisation supporting gig workers, digital rights for gig workers. And as Caroline explained, you know, I had the fortunate position of just signing a complaint in 2015 that went on. The lawyers took it all the way to the Supreme Court. So in some ways, my role is really symbolic. It was the lawyers that did the great work. Actually, it was three things that won the Supreme Court. It was great strategic litigation, great clever lawyers that did some wonderful work. But it was shoe leather organising by trade unions like the GMB union and our own union, the App Drivers and Couriers Union, and the solidarity of the workers, the campaigning and the communication to keep that cause alive and the understanding of our struggle on the front page and in the front of mind of policymakers, and that's what makes it a great campaign in my view. But there were two things that were about that case that really got me thinking about digital rights and the need for algorithmic transparency. Number one, we were really fortunate in how we were able to gather evidence for that case, because in the early days of Uber's platform, it was throwing off information, it was throwing off evidence, it was sending us messages, it was controlling us in a very clear way, and we gathered everything. We screenshot everything, we kept every email, and all of that was used in the tribunal. Since that time, all of these platforms have clammed up. They don't say things like they used to say them anymore, and they use very tricky language. So instead of training, it's onboarding. Instead of being a worker, you're a partner. Instead of something being a performance-related dismissal, you're accused of fraudulent activity. And so this is the game of misclassification as a kind of hall and mirrors that we live in, that's rhetorical and technological at the same time. But that's one of the problems now, is that if you want to assert your worker rights, you have to prove that you're in an employment relationship. And I haven't had that problem since I was 15 of trying to convince somebody that I'm in a relationship with them when they're on the other side of saying, no, we're not in a relationship. But that's the reality for gig workers, because gig employers want to say there's no relationship here, and the burden is upon you to prove that there is. Now, how are you going to do that when all of the communication is hidden away and all of the management control becomes algorithmic and automated? This is the problem, number one. The second practical problem was that Uber was making a case against me using my data. So Uber argued that why should we give this guy minimum wage rights and holiday pay, because he refused about 50% of the work that they offered to me. And they also used that message not only in court, but they used it in a Bayes parliamentary committee inquiry into the future world of work. they told that story about me without naming me. It was the same story, 91 hours a week, working, refusing half the work. But what they didn't say was, they didn't discuss the work I did do, they discussed the work I didn't do. So they never actually measured my productivity, but I did. So my productivity rate was actually 1.59 jobs per hour. And elsewhere in the evidence, Uber submitted that they expected a driver working between 40 and 60 hours a week to complete between 1.4 and 1.6 jobs per hour. So even though I was at the higher end of productivity, Uber expected at 60 hours a week, at 91 hours working, Uber was still going around saying I didn't deserve the minimum wage, and telling that story to government as well. And that made me realize, no, we have to get control of our data, because this is just, we cannot defend ourselves, we cannot assert our rights, we cannot prove our working time until we control that data. We're actually at the mercy. It's an informational war that we're having with these gig economy companies, and we have to control that data. Now, what I think has happened with the, in terms of the Supreme Court ruling in practical terms, is that we've shifted now from trying to assert control via contract, contractual control. I mean, those have been completely derided by the courts. The contracts that I worked for Uber under have been described as fictitious, artificial, faintly ridiculous. This is the language that was used by the Court of Appeal and the Employment Tribunal. And so now these companies are relying on algorithmic control. And so what are the key aspects of algorithmic control? Now, this is where I agree with Leo. These companies are not technological leaders. This is crap technology, but the control is absolute. Make no mistake about it. And the control that we're concerned about as workers are three principal areas. One is work allocation. So are you going to be a starved driver or a fed driver? And this is the old, analog terms of how minicab drivers think. Is the boss going to give you work, or are they going to have you sitting around and you're not going to get enough work for the hours that you've made yourself available? So work allocation is a serious issue. Performance management and profiling, we know that's going on. It's been hidden from us. And also surveillance is a big rising issue. So Uber has introduced surveillance technology into the UK. Bolt, the number 2 operator, just raised 800 million in a round of funding in December to go off and invest in surveillance technology like facial recognition, geolocation checking, and all sorts of surveillance for security, but also for performance management reasons also. And we have to understand those technologies, and we have to protect ourselves from them and assert our rights against them as much as we can. And so for the ABCU, just as a giveaway here, one of our organizing principles, one of our objects as a union is to control personal data. That's how important we think this is for us as a trade union, primarily of people working through apps, that we must have access to our data and full algorithmic transparency in how we're being managed by algorithm. And just this very day, we had a strike against Bolt. Please visit our Twitter stream, and I would appreciate any solidarity messages that you can give us. ADC Union on Twitter. We had a strike, 24-hour strike that ends at midnight tonight. But one of our demands from Bolt is that we get access to our data. We have made a complaint to the Estonian Data Protection Authority, and the Data Protection Authority there has ordered Bolt to comply with the group subject access requests that we made via ADC Union through Worker Info Exchange. So what are the areas of data that we're thinking are really important here? Well, firstly, it is, on this ascending line of conflict. It's the data we entered into the black box ourselves, our name, our address, our photograph, nothing particularly controversial about that. Then there is the, I'm just sharing my screen now, thank you for giving me that access. Then there's the data observed by the machine, that is GPS records, trip information, and so on. This is the machine collecting data about us at work. And then finally, this red zone, this is where the most conflict is this inference data. This is the profiling that Uber and platform gig economy employers do on the workers, and this is not information that they want to release to workers, but we're perfectly entitled to have it under the GDPR. And so what we're trying to do in this arena is three things. We're trying to get access to our data. We're trying to demand the algorithmic transparency. So people think about data protection rights in terms of access, making subject access requests, but they also need to understand that we're entitled to algorithmic transparency, or in the language of the GDPR and Data Protection Act, we call that the logic of processing. And then finally, when we have that, and we can identify automated decision-making, you are entitled to certain protections from unfair automated decisions that have been made against you at work. And so what would we be doing then in terms of access, in terms of setting up a data trust? So collectively, individually and in absolute terms, but also aggregate relative to the pack, but also over time, how much was I really paid? How was my time utilized? Because one of the evils of the gig economy is to waste people's time. You know, because you're not paying for all of people's working time, you oversupply and by about 50%, and people are underutilized in their work. And this is really inefficient use of people and their meager assets. So how was my time and vehicle really utilized? And what was the quality and quantity of work that was offered? The dispatch rates, was I a fed or starved driver? And if I was fired, why was I fired? And so then when we get to that's the data trust bit, but then let's think about the algorithmic transparency, how was I managed and so on. A big part of this now is surveillance. And let me give you a practical example of what we're dealing with here when we talk about surveillance and automated decision making. This picture here is one of the ADC members, a guy called Mr. Imran Javed Raja. And the picture, these are profile pictures from Uber. This is the same man. Now, Imran has given me permission to share this, but Imran, his brother died, and he went through a period of reflection. He turned to his religion and he decided to grow a beard because that's what his brother wanted. And this is him. He changed his profile. Now, because of this, Uber's facial recognition system didn't recognize him. He was automatically deactivated as a result. Not only that, he was reported to Transport for London, who then revoked his private hire driver's license. We got involved and we were able to persuade Uber that this was incorrect, that this was the incorrect use of the technology, and this was a false positive. They recanted and put him back on. Then we had to go to Transport for London and agree the same thing. But how many other people are out there? You know, this is the type of facial recognition technology being used by Uber in the United Kingdom, provided by Microsoft, that Microsoft will no longer provide to US police forces since the Black Lives Matter riots last year. It's got a 3% failure rate overall. So for 100,000 minicab drivers in London, that's 3,000 that could fail. That rises to 12% for people of colour and 20% to women of colour. These are unacceptable failure rates, and there is no governance because these are workers without rights. The safeguards are simply not there, and people need to be protected from that. So we brought some litigation, and I know I'm running out of time, so I better wrap this up very soon. We brought some litigation in the Netherlands. Two banks of litigation. One is to do with access rights and algorithmic transparency, and the second has got to do with automated decision making. So 6 drivers, and I'll deal with the automated decision making firstly. 6 drivers that we say were robo-fired. Uber failed to defend those cases, then pretended or said that they didn't get served properly. They didn't know, even though they were served by a bailiff twice, registered post and emails, and they failed to defend those cases, and those 6 drivers have been ordered to be reinstated to their jobs and to be paid compensation. Now, those drivers had their licenses revoked. We went to the magistrates' court, and every time we went to the magistrates' court, though magistrates have reinstated their licenses also. But this is a serious wake-up call that this type of thing can happen. Now, in terms of the access rights and algorithmic transparency, we've made we've lost some ground on access and gained more ground on algorithmic transparency. So what first of all, the court ordered that were admissible. Both Uber and Ola Cabs tried to argue that it was an abuse of GDPR rights, that we might set up a data trust for workers, and that collective purposes was an abuse of the GDPR process. The courts rejected that argument. The court ordered that they provide transparency in the surveillance system, so Uber's real-time identification system and Ola's Guardian system. They ordered transparency of those surveillance systems and how they're used with workers. They ordered Uber to reveal data used in the dismissal of 2 drivers, one in Portugal, one in the UK, where the alleged fraudulent activity would not substantiate it in any way, shape, or form. And then profiling, this is really interesting. This is the profiles that are used in work allocation. So I build a profile around these drivers, and then I process these profiles in work allocation. So myself and Leo, one of the profiles is fraud probability. So Leo is a respectable guy, as you can see. He's got doctor before his name, and he was not a fraud risk. He's a 1% fraud risk. I'm, not trustworthy at all. I'm a 90% fraud risk. I don't know why this is a binary issue, why this is not a binary issue, but Leo and I have been on the same street. All things being equal, Leo's going to get the work. But the problem is that Ola wouldn't release the fraud probability score or the methodology to workers. The court has ordered that that's not acceptable. They have to do so from now on. But it's really ethically sketchy ground to be creating those types of morality profiles on workers. Also earnings profiles. So the implication is if you're a hustler, then you'll get more work in the future, but that has a kind of a circular reinforcement problem. Also interestingly, where we made some ground is the deduction of wages. The court ordered that a deduction of wages made by Ola was an automated decision, and that triggers new rights for protection in automated decision making. And finally, with ratings, the court ordered much more transparency on the ratings that are given by passengers to drivers. Now, finally, I'll close with just one problem about this issue of human intervention and in automated decision making. So firstly, I will say that it's not a binary issue. Either a decision is automated or it's manual. There's actually a middle ground. Uber uses a lot of natural language programming or processing. And so, a driver will maybe make an appeal after a deactivation or a dismissal, and they'll get the same response verbatim used all the time. What's happening here is that there are not enough staff to manage or listen to appeals. Something comes in, some program will do some word and sentiment analysis, and they'll just pop up some text, suggested text for the customer service agent to do, and all they do is like Tinder, swipe right or left and send it out. That's what's happening. That's kind of semi-automated processes. But the question under the law is that a meaningful human intervention. The same thing with the photo recognition thing. Uber's defense of that case is that 2 humans reviewed it. But what human is going to be able to look at those photographs and say, well, I'm confident enough, I'm trained enough to understand how the system failed. I have enough authority to overrule the system. What is at stake here? Uber's license, which it lost twice, versus 2 gig workers who have no rights and no recourse anyway. So I know which way I'll err. I'll err on kicking these drivers out because there's no recourse. That's the problem with this kind of human intervention and automated decision making is what is really meaningful in that context. I think I better stop. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that was helpful, and thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. It was more than helpful, and it was very interesting, amazing stuff. As you say, the use of language and misinterpretation by employers is widespread, and who can get over the idea of deactivating workers? I mean, what kind of language is that to use about human beings? You're quite right that data and facts, having those at our fingertips, are what will help us to win the battle, the information war with employers. And I'm glad to hear that you're still winning victories. That's marvelous stuff. We will of course put everything out that you've given us. I don't know whether your slides are available, but we can put those out afterwards, and if you've got any more information, then they will go out there too. Clearly we will support any information we can, as you suggested, via the Twitter. I don't know whether you use Strike Map at all, but they're very good at getting information out about where strikes are and how they're happening and how people can support them. So it's a good thing to get into if you haven't done so already. That's brilliant. Now, where are we? So we've got about 6 minutes left before 8 o'clock. Now, I don't know whether everybody, there's already been some good comments in the chat box. For instance, you know, saying that the recognition of union laws need to be amended to include data, as well as the right to negotiate on pays, hours and holidays. That's right. I mean, from the Institute's point of view, the recognition laws just need updating anyway, because they're not good enough for getting unions in the workplace where they've got members. So that is absolutely true. So let's think. So Leo, you mentioned something to do with digital literacy in your one, and there's been a question in saying, could you expand on this or post some resources in the chat on it? Anything that's posted in the chat, we will send out after the event, so that's always helpful.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that, I don't know, the government says that they're very much in favour of, and the businesses say they're very much in favour of. You know, the FT every couple of months says, oh, there's a massive digital skills shortage. And what they mean is not just, you know, can old people use PowerPoint, but how many computer programmers do we have? And yet, you know, we've got a program which I'm not involved in at all at Durham in the computer science department called Tech Up Women, which has tried to make a successor program called Tech Up Unemployed, or I think that's a provisional name. I think they might get a catchier title to it. And they've been looking for funding for months, and they are struggling to find funding to complete that program, which is basically, you know, senior computer scientists going out to people who've lost their job because of COVID and teaching them to program. You'd have thought that was the easiest thing in the world to get funding for, and apparently not. So I think the demise of the Union Learning Fund last year, which actually didn't see that much press outrage about it, you know, for something that had been fairly well established for a number of decades. Again, that was often doing things around digital literacy and things like that, and that was axed. So I think there are, yeah, in terms of like specific resources, there are lots of open source things. A lot of people are somehow autodidacts, but I think there's a bit of a disconnect now between the kind of talk that big business and the government are putting out and the walk that is being walked, as it were.
Thanks very much. Yeah. And Paul Day has said that we need transparency, as all the speakers have said, on who sets the algorithms, how and they are updated. Otherwise, discrimination and unfairness can be built in. Automating bad work just makes bad work happen quicker and more consistently, which who can argue with that? I know we did some work with ASLEF, and they wondered why they constantly failed to attract women as train drivers, and actually when they looked into it with some more detail, they saw that the automatic recruitment systems that they use, recruitment and selection methods, just excluded women from getting further in the process. So they're all things that we can look at. So how could we use automation to reduce working time for workers? I touched on that we're going to discuss next time, but are there any ideas on that? Louisa, you haven't said anything for a while. How's your voice doing?
It's all right. I'm still here. I mean, I think with the change to 24/7 working and the shift patterns that we're using, people can get a work-life balance if there is a decent wage to attach to that. So I think automation works for people to reduce their working week, and I think that there is a appetite for that. But of course, the big question on all of this is how much we're going to get paid. And so, you know, yes, I think this is something that we can negotiate. And I think the layoff clauses and the top-up clauses and the conversations that we've had with employers due to COVID and furlough has really opened the door to that. And I think people understand that work-life balance is necessary. And I think we can genuinely have that bargaining agenda going forward. So yeah, I'm optimistic that it is something that we can do in the future. And I kept my voice.
Yeah, we're optimistic on it too. In fact, we're just working with the CSEU and the Alex Ferry Foundation to look at how do we argue for and make the case for shorter working time without loss of pay, I should add. Because, you know, we don't need any more loss of work. So question to James, do you know how many face images those Uber employees were manually checking per minute? Oh, that's a very technical question. Have you got the figures at your fingertips, James?
Well, no, I think the checking is mostly automated. It's the ones that fail that come back and then for human intervention. So I don't know what the number is, but I will tell you this, that we did the Freedom of Information request because every firing, dismissal, deactivation that's done in London must be reported to Transport for London for licensing action. And in the 6-month period from July 1st to December 31st last year, nearly 5,000 drivers were reported. So that's a huge, if you think there's about 60, 70,000 active minicab drivers, and in a 6-month period, nearly 5,000 of them are being fired on mostly automated means by these platforms. That's just monstrous. And the abuse of worker rights without any proper appeal process through these semi-automated means or fully automated means is just a monstrous thing to do, but it also represents a huge risk for the rest of the economy because these practices are being normalized in the gig economy and then they go out from there.
And you just touched on an interesting issue because, of course, the use of licensing and procurement, two things that are very powerful in the government's control, could be used to set standards and conditions on how companies operate, if of course they chose to do it, if they had the political will. That's another seminar, I think. But anyway, look, there's been loads of very interesting issues here tonight. Leo, I'm particularly interested in your blacklist of companies that misuse or turn the tables on them, so that we blacklist those who misuse digital data as opposed to the other way around. So I'm sure my colleague Sarah, her fingers will be itching to get something like that on our website as a tool for us to use. Can I just say thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you to our speakers. That was brilliant. All the information that has been put in chat box will be distributed to our participants who didn't all turn up tonight, by the way. I'm sure they will be watching the follow-up video, so they will still be able to hear your wise words. So thank you again. There will be a slide up at the end on how people can sign up for our news brief, which will tell you about all the wonderful events that are coming up in the future. So please do sign up. Please do join us at future events. Thank you again for our speakers and to our audience. And well, if you're going to watch football, I hope you enjoy it. Thanks very much.